Hello, everyone. Um, Thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I'm Joe Sergi, and I wanted to kind of share with you some thoughts about an article that I published in the inaugural issue of the International Journal of Community Wellbeing. And the title of that article is "What Type of Indicators Should Be Used to Capture Community Well-Being Comprehensively?" Okay. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. So again, it is based on this article, and I'm going to take you through it. So there's the title of the article. And by the way, if you want a copy of these slides, I'll be more than happy to email them to you. So the gist of this article is that it sort of makes a distinction between and among different theories of community well-being, and the idea is that one needs to focus on a specific theory or maybe a set of theories that would help you um, um, envision or try and figure out what these community indicators that may be most suited to your own community. And then we'll be talking about individual versus community well-being, and then input versus output indicators, and indicators focusing on the community at large versus vulnerable segments, and indicators of well-being versus ill-being. Okay, so making those distinctions would allow us to say, okay, we need to capture the sort of the umbrella of these types of indicators and make sure that all accounted for. Let's start out with the first um, uh, the first idea, which is indicators based on theories of community well-being. Now, some of the popular theories in community well-being can be classified in terms of socioeconomic development, personal utility, just society, human development, sustainability, and functioning. These are different, what you call not only theories of community well-being, but in essence, paradigms of research. There's a whole program of research that is based on these different ideas. Let's take, for example, the most obvious one would be sustainability. Sustainability, we have a huge program of research on what sustainability is. And sustainability focuses very much on the ecosystem, meaning the environment, and then but it takes into account two other dimensions, and that is human well-being, and therefore indicators of human well-being, and also what we call equity indicators. Hossein's ideas is very much grounded in personal utility. Personal utility focuses on the actual how residents in a given community feel about certain conditions and certain services in the community, how satisfied or dissatisfied with these, and ultimately how their level of satisfaction and dissatisfaction affects their evaluation of the quality of life in their community. Just society is an example of what we call social justice. A lot of people tend to focus on justice types of issues in terms of maybe race relations and gender equality and allowing other vulnerable populations to have access, sort of equal access to community services and conditions, and so forth. So I'm not going to have time to really get into these, these theories are well described in the article, so you'll be able to read all about them in the article. Okay, let's move on to the second point, which is individual versus community well-being. In this context, the idea, well, there's so many of the indicators tend to be focused on the residents themselves, meaning the individual residents, community residents. But on the other hand, there are other indicators that focus on the community at large without necessarily focusing on the residents, especially for those people who do survey research and try and capture, for example, satisfaction with, for example, transportation versus among many other types of services in the community. These tend to be individual based, right? So again, the example that I have here is satisfaction with utility services. Well, on the other hand, community level indicators tend to be very much at the community level. And the example would be crime rate. The crime rate at the community at large, capturing the community at large. And the idea is that, there are indicators that focuses on the community at large, which captures that with the fact that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The parts would be the residents, right? So if you can capture satisfaction in the mind of each resident in the community, yes, that's good, but you also need to capture the whole, and the whole may be greater than the sum of the parts. So you can't just simply count, satisfaction of services in the community and say, okay, I have those community quality of life indicators. Well, that's not sufficient. That's not sufficient, right? So the idea is that we need to incorporate both sets of indicators, individual and community level indicators. The third point is input versus output indicators. Now, what does that mean? Input versus output indicators. So input indicators are related to action or policies. So, and an example here, for example, an example would be a dollar amount of financial investment in prenatal care for pregnant women. Okay, so this is something that, again, you do, it's action oriented versus an outcome. The outcome would be, again, output indicators are related to outcomes such as changes in average years of life expectancy, infant and child death rates, and rates of criminal activities. Now, again, these are outcomes, right? Outcomes of certain things that happen in the community, certain services, certain policies, programmatic action, that kind of thing. So the idea then is that when you're developing or when you're accounting indicators of community quality of life, you need to have both sets. You need to have policy or action-oriented types of indicators, as well as what you call outcome indicators. They're both essential. Okay, let's move on to, again, the fourth point, and that is indicators focusing on the community at large versus vulnerable population. So there's so many, community indicator projects that focus on not necessarily on the community at large, and they do it, most of them do actually, but they focus on specific populations within, like, for example, the disabled, or women, or the poor, or specific minorities or children. Again, these are vulnerable populations, and one develops a whole set of community quality of life indicators around those particular segments, which you call vulnerable segments. So again, the idea is that if you're doing community quality of life type of research, and you're trying to identify those indicators, you need to take into account both. You need to, to do this at large, as well as identifying those vulnerable populations within the community, and also develop those indicators that would be relegated to those populations. Finally, we can talk about, I have a specific slide that that I kind of skipped, which essentially says exactly what I need to say about, again, the community at large versus vulnerable segments. The final point is indicators of well-being versus ill-being. Now, here, again, we make the distinction between ill-being and well-being. Again, ill-being indicators reflect aspects of satisfaction of basic needs. So again, if you're familiar with Maslow's idea of human motivation or human needs, or the hierarchy of needs, the basic needs that are so important, and not being able to meet those basic needs generate what we call ill-being. But on the other hand, in the context of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can talk about growth needs, and meeting growth needs generate, again, a sense of satisfaction rather than dissatisfaction. So again, the focus is, so the examples that I have on this slide is that ill-being indicators related to social life at the individual level include social isolation, social disengagement, social avoidance, social shyness, personal victimization. And at the community level, these indicators may be reflected in community strife and crime rate. These are indicators of ill-being. Well, and again, in contrast, well-being indicators reflect satisfaction of growth needs, which, again, the example would be well-being indicators related to leisure life include frequent engagement in leisure activities, social connections built through leisure engagement, and sense of relaxation and stress reduction during leisure time. At the community level, these indicators may be reflected through readily accessible leisure facilities and spaces, and high participation rates in diverse leisure activities. So you see that there's quite a bit of difference between focusing on indicators that capture ill-being at the individual and the community level versus indicators that capture well-being at the individual and community levels. And the point is that, again, if we're doing this comprehensively, we need to do both. Again, we need to do both. We need to capture indicators of well-being as well as ill-being. Okay, so that's the gist of my little story. So again, what we did is we talked about how we can capture community indicators comprehensively, and that means that we need to kind of focus on specific theories of community well-being and make sure that we feel comfortable with these theories, because these theories have their own set of indicators. So again, if you're talking about something like personal utility, again, the idea is to capture satisfaction with community services and conditions, and that in essence would give you an entree to those indicators. Individual versus community well-being, again, we talked about that in terms of doing both. You need to capture indicators both at the individual level as well as the community level, and the reason being because the sum of the parts does not capture the whole. In the input versus output indicators, we talked about action indicators versus outcome indicators, and we need to have both action indicators as well as outcome indicators. And indicators focusing on the community at large versus vulnerable populations, yes, we need to do both. And finally, indicators of well-being versus ill-being. Again, we need to capture both sets of indicators in order to comprehensively assess the quality of life of the community over time. So that's the gist of it. And again, thank you. And if you'd like to have a copy, just send me an email. It's sergi@vt.edu. I'll be more than happy to send you those slides. Thank you again.